Campside Media.
Hey, Campside listeners. Welcome to Inside the Tent, our series where we go behind the mic of our hit podcasts. I'm Lily Houston Smith, and here at Campside, I help produce the show Infamous. Infamous is a weekly podcast that's about all sorts of scandals, trends, pop culture news. And today I sat down with our co-hosts Vanessa Grigoriadis and Natalie Robehmed to look back on the almost 100 episodes we've made. They talk a little bit about their favorite stories and what goes into choosing each week's topic. Vanessa and Natalie both have backgrounds as magazine writers, and on Infamous, they bring some of the magic of print journalism into audio. If you want to hear more behind-the-scenes content from our shows and the people who made them, head to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com. Now, here's my conversation with Infamous co-hosts Vanessa and Natalie. So we're coming up on 100 episodes of Infamous.
Oh, my God.
So exciting.
That's crazy.
So if you can think back a couple years ago, what was it that attracted you both to working on this series in the first place?
I think we wanted to do a series that represented what we loved about old school magazines. Tina Brown used to call it The Mix. What's in the mix this week? And, there'll be some politics, there'll be some scandal, there'll be some sort of trend piece, like what are people talking about? Before Instagram and TikTok and all of this, people actually discussed what they had read in magazines at cocktail parties. We would often describe it, in editorial meetings, like, oh, that seems like a good cocktail chatter piece. That seems like something somebody would say to somebody else at a party, like, oh, hey, did you read blah, 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 blah. It's crazy what's happening there. So I have long been associated with Vanity Fair, worked there a bunch, and I really thought there's a place in the audio universe for Vanity Fair as a magazine. So that was my initial concept. What about you, Natalie?
I actually started a little more behind the scenes on Infamous as a writer and reporter. And what I loved about it was kind of the mix of high and low of subjects, where we're dealing with pop culture figures, somebody like Kylie Jenner, who I reported a lot on when I was at Forbes before working in podcasting. And we actually did a bunch of episodes on all of the scandals surrounding, is she a billionaire, isn't she a billionaire, and her sort of Kylie Cosmetics fortune. But I loved that we kind of like take pop culture figures and treat them seriously and do a whole mix of both business and scandal, whether we're talking about Mr. Beast or Johnny Depp or a new kind of true crime story. That high-low mix was very appealing to me.
Right. Like, I mean, again, I can't believe I'm referencing Tina Brown twice in this conversation, but, she used to say every good publication needs a little bit of bad taste, right? And so the idea of mixing something like Gabe Sherman, who just put out The Apprentice, which is an amazing movie about the relationship between Roy Cohn and Donald Trump, and he was on Infamous speaking about his relationship with Steve Bannon, which is long and wide-ranging, and he traveled to Tokyo on a private jet with Steve Bannon to see populism sort of at work, quote unquote, in Japan while he was meeting investors. To take this really accomplished writer and his experience with one of the biggest political influences of our time and mix that with something like, why does my 8-year-old love Mr. Beast and what does it mean? I love that. Like, to me, that's the most fun part of even making audio, is the clash of different textures and kinds of interviews and kinds of people and kinds of stories. That's why we, as a company, we do a ton of true crime. We do a lot of investigative work. And Infamous was conceptualized as something that would be quote unquote light investigative, where we do look into things and we do a lot of reporting. But the northern star of the show is what's the greatest story that we can tell and what would a listener want after hearing about Maria Butina, the spy, and her crazy relationship with a guy in the Dakotas. Do we want to hear then something more fun about the behind the scenes of the 50 Shades of Grey movie? And so we hope listeners appreciate how much we mess with the timing of these episodes and the cadence of the episodes, because we, all three of us, know on this recording that we do move things in and out of slots very often because we're trying to think of what a listener would enjoy hearing next.
Yeah. And to me, we do a wide range of stories because I think no story is ever just only one thing. And I think no one person is interested in just one thing. And sometimes I actually think like our algorithms are a little bit patronizing to us, and that they kind of like are so curated and specific. And we're all interested in a bunch of different things. I do want to know about the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders, because even if it's ostensibly a story about a football cheerleading squad, it's also really about women's labor and the feminism movement and what has been going on in women's rights or labor rights over the last however many couple decades.
So maybe because the show is so varied, it is impossible to answer this question, but do either of you have a favorite episode or a favorite arc or a favorite interview that you worked on?
Yeah, my favorite episode is actually the series that we did on Kelly and the Satanic Panic, originally aired back in 2023. And that is the story of this woman, Kelly Michaels, who was convicted of some absolutely horrible crimes, but then it turned out that she actually never did them, and she ended up being released from jail. And that story is so fascinating because it's kind of dealing with the worst stuff in the world, essentially horrible things happening to very young children. But it's actually all about memory and our own memories and how memories shape us and how we shape our memories. And for me, just learning about our brains in that way and talking to these experts, and also just learning about how our ideas of memory and how we conceive of time has changed over time. You know, like that back in the day in the 80s, this idea of repressed memories were so important, and how that comes out of all these psychologists being very trained in Freud and all that kind of stuff was absolutely fascinating to me. And just like being able to get a little bit more philosophical with it was that's my favorite story. And it's just an incredible story, and she's an incredible character. And I mean, how often do you get to speak to somebody who spent years in prison, actually a lot of it in solitary confinement, for something she never did?
Yeah, and I think that story is a great example of the way we try to approach pretty much all of these stories, which is to do something unexpected. I think the idea of putting a lot of the religious thought that she was steeped in at the beginning of that first episode, and really talking about what the Satanic Panic means and the history of the Satanic Panic before switching into the charges of child abuse, was something that we all talked about a lot and were very concerned in terms of drawing listeners in. How do we give the story that's real and true and journalistically sound, while also giving something that people can grab onto that's not as disturbing? So like, I believe a lot of good writing is about switching in between medicine and sweets. Like
Sugar.
You got to have the sugar, you got to have the cinnamon, you got to have the whipped cream, you got to have things that like draw people in. It's a process of seduction, right? And this show is actually a very produced and written show. It's not really a chat show, although we are doing a ton of interviews, and more you will be listening to interviews in a lot of the episodes. It's a pretty deliberate show in choice of topic, choice of guest, in some of the writing that gets done.
But Vanessa, what's your favorite episode?
My favorite episode that Natalie was in charge of and is so amazing is our series about the princesses of Dubai. I mean, Natalie, why don't you tell people about it?
Yeah. So these episodes, they're called Dubai's Missing Princesses. Again, we originally published them in 2023, and they dive into the story of Sheikha Latifa, who was basically tried to escape from Dubai. And she is the daughter of Dubai's ruler, Sheikh Mohammed. But we also really got to look into the story of her half-sister, Shamsa, who also ran away, and Princess Haya, who was Sheikh Mohammed's wife, who in a different situation also fled the country. So it's actually the story of kind of three princesses, I guess, sheikhas, who have tried to run away from Dubai, and just absolutely the stuff of a Bond movie, you know, like Latifa was smuggled out of the city in the trunk of a car, and then there's jet skis to a dinghy to a boat, and then Indian commandos storming the boat to bring her back to Dubai and allegedly drugging her. And a lot of that we were able to find out from British court documents. She'd also recorded a ton of videos as well, describing her own situation, where she was essentially taken back to Dubai and then, in her own words, kept prisoner. And there are some questions as to the extent to which she's free now, despite pictures being posted on Instagram. But, that story is really important to me because I grew up in Dubai, as I'm sure listeners are probably sick of hearing about now by now.
Like, I grew up in Dubai. I mean, wait, can I say though, because nobody knows what your accent is from. So I think it is important to say where you're from.
I know. I guess like dropped in the middle of an ocean is where my accent's from. But yeah, I grew up in Dubai. My mom's English, my dad's Lebanese. And so I went to a British school there and then came to the US for college. And so my accent is now just a strange mishmash where some people think I'm Australian and some people think I'm English and some people don't realize I have an accent. One of my friends, just as after they met me, thought that I was from the Midwest with a speech impediment.
Oh,
so,
nice.
Okay. Okay, so in almost 100 episodes, we fit so much into this show. If this conversation's any indication, we get a lot in there. But we also all know, the three of us here know, that there's a lot on the chopping block also. Is there anything that hasn't made it into the show? A little peek behind the curtain. Is there anything that didn't make it into the show that you want to talk about?
Well, we almost keep clippings, right? Like we say, like, okay, when Kim Kardashian goes public with Skims, we're going to do that. So we keep these little files of like, if something breaks, we'll do something on it.
What about you, Natalie? Is there anything that didn't make it into the show that you want to talk about?
Yeah, the one story that I think there's even more than we were able to fit in to so many episodes, 6 episodes about it, was the Ruby Franke story. That series is all about the Mormon momfluencer Ruby Franke and a therapist friend of hers called Jodi Hildebrandt, and the way in which these two women came together and sort of devolved into, very sadly, physically, probably emotionally abusing Ruby's children. And it ended with a very shocking arrest and conviction of both Ruby and Jodi, who are now in jail. And so as part of reporting that, there were so many documents and police videos, like body cam footage, recordings from the interviews, their police interviews that we were able to get from the Utah government. And we used a lot of them, but there was still so much that just simply couldn't make it in. And honestly, a lot of it was because it was too disturbing. I watched all of those videos and it was really tough and really hard to sit through, watching videos of an emaciated child being found by police officers. And, a lot of them really did move me to tears. Your heart just breaks.
Yeah, I think that's one thing we really strive to do in the show is get to the emotional core of what these stories are. They aren't just stories about the rich and famous and their foibles. They're also about their victims. We have done quite a bit about child abuse, and a lot of the stories that break, like Momfluencer breaks bad, when you really look at them, they're much more complex, and the children are often the people who are being hurt.
Yeah. And to me, that story also is so much about fame and Mormonism and a woman striving for power within the ways that she's allowed to within the Mormon church, which means within the home, and becoming an influencer through showing her home life. But also at the same time, part of her home life is her children. And for me, a big question coming out of that series is the burgeoning field of child labor rights in the digital sphere, where I have a lot of questions as to whether it's ethical for momfluencers to be posting their children. And because you're essentially making money off of your kids, and your kids are under 18 and they might say they want to be on camera, but like, do they understand what being on camera means?
Yeah, and I would just say, like, this season coming up, we are planning to cover the murder that happened in the Bethesda Lululemon between 2 employees who were there. And unlike a show that would do that as just a true crime story, we're really going to get into Lululemon's corporate culture. What is athleisure? What does it stand for? This idea of self-optimization and striving. And the reason behind that murder was that one of the employees thought that this was her golden ticket to, like, like the good life. So we always look for that behind every story.
It's always about something else.
It's always about something else. Everything is not
That's our
about
tagline.
it. Yeah.
Everything's about everything. What a terrible tagline.
Well, thank you guys for answering these questions. It's fun to walk down memory lane 4 seasons in and to look forward to season 5.
Oh my God.
Thank you. I don't think people even know there have been that many episodes.
We don't really divide the seasons in any sort of meaningful way.
So please go back and listen to, there's almost 100 episodes there for you to listen to. You can pick and choose and see how you like the show. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Vanessa and Natalie and everyone else who's worked with us on Infamous. And thank you for listening to Inside the Tent. Don't forget to head over to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com.